French artist and illustrator Maurice Miler was born in the port of Le Havre in 1871. His family were far from wealthy, but somehow he acquired enough money to travel to Paris in 1889 to study at the School of Decorative Arts and the School of Fine Art in the city. With his art education completed, he set himself up as a painter, printmaker and illustrator, and he was prolific in all these endeavours. His oil paintings and dry point etchings were exhibited regularly and fetched good prices from collectors. His commercial illustration also flourished early on in his career, and from around 1900 onwards he became popular as a poster artist. He worked from a studio in Paris and publicly broadcast his services with a self-promotional poster which eloquently demonstrated the truth of the adage that sex sells. And although not all his work was erotic, the majority of it was to one degree or another. He was already in his mid-40s in 1914, so he didn't serve in the Great War, and it was in that year that he also began working for Parisian magazines, including La Vie Parisienne, Le Sourire and Fantasio. Sometimes his illustrations of females in the magazines were fairly respectable and fully clothed, but more frequently they were in one state of undress or another. All were drawn with an exquisite fine pen technique, usually shaded with watercolour washes, and sometimes using more opaque gouache and printed in duotone. Millière didn't confine himself to pure pin-up work, and he also illustrated more elaborate comic scenes involving other characters, usually male, which were set in well-evoked everyday environments. Many of his girls were not realistically proportioned, and he tended to give them enlarged heads, strongly suggestive of later comic book, animation and manga stereotypes. Their cute doll-like appeal led to them actually being made as limited edition boudoir figures, which were considered collector's items in their day, and his originals still circulate on the antique market at wildly inflated prices. By the 1930s, Millière's commercial work had come to be increasingly considered as outdated, but occasional commissions continued to come his way, and he carried on painting with undiminished success. By this time he'd become wealthy, and he invested in his own Parisian private drawing and painting school, which was attended by many aspiring younger artists and illustrators. And Maurice Miler died in 1946 at the age of 74. The illustrator known as Alejandro Syria was born in Oviedo in Spain in 1890 as Nicanor Balbino Alvarez Diaz, and I'm grateful I won't have to try to pronounce that again. Although his talent for artistic expression had been obvious from an early age, he actually studied accountancy, and in 1910, at the age of 20, he left Spain for Buenos Aires and took a job in that profession. When it came to art, he was entirely self-taught, and to date he'd only considered it a hobby. But with nothing to lose, he began submitting drawings to Argentinian newspapers and magazines, many of which were published. In 1912, his work was noticed by the editor of Caras y Caretas magazine, who was impressed enough to invite Sirio to work freelance for them and their sister magazine Plus Ultra. Before long, it became obvious that both magazines could keep him supplied with enough work to make a good living, and the career in accountancy came to an abrupt end. He also cultivated business relationships with any number of other magazines and newspapers in Argentina, and even created this unrecognisably atypical cartoon for the Spanish magazine Nuevo Mundo. In 1924, he was hired as the art editor for the Sunday supplement of the newspaper La Nación, and this led to more illustration work, some of which was comic and some of which was not. In the later 1920s, the author Enrique Larreta asked Sirio to illustrate his book, The Glory of Don Ramiro. Sirio travelled back to Spain to make observational drawings for the setting of the story, and then headed back to Argentina to finish the job. The book was published to great acclaim in 1929, and his reputation for creating astonishingly precise and complex pen and ink drawings grew. The majority of the rest of his career would be devoted to developing and refining this technique, although on occasion he used a heavier, more calligraphic line, and at other times he left large open areas devoid of inking, reminiscent of the work of Aubrey Beardsley. There was colour work too, and although they were nothing like as impressive or distinctive as the monochromes, they had their own quirky appeal. For these he used combinations of ink, watercolour and tempera paint, and oddly he seems to have never colour washed his intricate pen and ink work, keeping the two approaches separate. By 1930 he'd become wealthy enough to no longer have to work, and in 1931 he travelled to Paris for a year to take full advantage of the bohemian social life there, rubbing shoulders with the great and good of European art. He returned in 1932 to Buenos Aires, supposedly to retire. But it seems he couldn't give up illustration entirely, and every few years he would agree to illustrate books if the project aroused his interest. The last book Sirio illustrated was La Pampa Erguida by Federico Garcia Sanchez in 1951, and unfortunately he died a couple of years later in Buenos Aires in 1953 at the relatively young age of 62. Pulp fiction artist George Grosz was born in 1909 in Brooklyn to Jewish-Hungarian immigrant parents. His father was a successful fashion illustrator, working mostly for mail-order catalogues, and when in 1927 George enrolled at the Pratt Institute, he spent a lot of his time helping his father in his Manhattan studio. This gave him a significant advantage over others starting out, as he already had a clear understanding of how the business of illustration was conducted. And when he graduated in 1931, he found work immediately. His early pulp magazine work was mostly for mystery and Western-themed stories, and once he had proven his worth, he started to get more commissions from the publisher's fiction house, and it didn't take long for him to become their leading illustrator. From the mid-1930s onward, he painted hundreds of suitably over-the-top covers for any number of titles, across a remarkably diverse range of genres and themes, all of which he tackled with visual authority and attention to detail. His figures were almost invariably drawn from life, but how he referenced the details of place and period isn't recorded. Painting with oils on board or canvas was virtually compulsory in the pulp market, and his mastery and tight control of the medium can't be overstated. Unfortunately, pulp magazine covers weren't particularly well printed, and the published end results never did the originals justice. If he created any line-only illustration, it's been very well hidden. And by 1940 he'd become immensely successful, and he bought a house in Queens and a summer house in Pennsylvania. In 1942 he was rejected for military service in World War II because he had seriously diminished vision in his right eye. Why this condition seems to have not had any negative impact on his ability to paint, I can't imagine. After the war, pulp magazines began to fall out of favour with the public, but Grosz started working in the new, flourishing paperback book market, and his slick paintings decorated the covers of many gloriously trashy novels for decades to come. There was also a real growth in larger format men's magazines in the 50s and 60s, for which Grosz was ideally suited, and he created dozens of macho man scenarios to keep the readers happy in their fantasies. Although he wasn't actually thought of as a pin-up artist, it goes without saying that his female figures were usually exploited for erotic purposes, and he did on occasion also produce classic pin-ups for the cover of the racy magazine Showgirls. Grosz managed a long and successful career right through the 1970s, and even in the 1980s he was still creating more covers for the popular Nick Carter series. But eventually old age got the better of him, and with more than a half-century of illustration behind him, George Grosz died at the age of 94 in 2003. It's by no means certain that Elisabeth Ivanovsky actually qualifies as unsung. I'd certainly never heard of her until recently, but nevertheless she was an internationally respected children's illustrator, and so it might just be ignorance on my part. But I'm particularly taken with her work, so unsung or not, she's included. She was born in 1910 in the region known as Bessarabia, in what was then part of the Russian Empire. Her actual name was a virtual impossibility for anyone outside Russia to pronounce, so she wisely adopted the westernized version of it when she emigrated to Belgium in 1932. On arrival, she enrolled at the Higher Institute of Architecture and Decoration in Brussels, and even as a student she created a limited edition portfolio of pochoir prints titled Circus, and they were later published in book form. And within a year of graduation, she had created 2 children's picture books, which were both published in 1935. Big and Small and 2 Russian Tales were demonstrations of her natural affinity for child-friendly images, and both books were quickly successful. Her chosen style and technique for these was very much in the Russian folk art tradition, and the illustrations struck a balance between abstraction and representation, using rough tonal renders and non-naturalistic colour palettes. In 1936 she illustrated the children's book Basbasina Boulou, written by Franz Helens. This story was about an African carved figure, and Ivanovsky created some very plausible African-influenced flat illustrations which added greatly to the exotic appeal of the story. By this point her reputation as both a children's illustrator and writer had grown considerably, and when not illustrating her own work she happily collaborated with other writers. Easily the most significant of these collaborations began in 1937, when she first worked with Marcel Verité, and they would continue to work together regularly for the next half-century. In the early 1940s she created many engaging and decorative illustrations for traditional Belgian songs, and in 1944 she began a series of her own authored stories about woodland creatures. The first of these was Bonhomme des Bois. This charming picture book, and all the others in the series, made great creative use of white space, simple flat coloured areas and minimal coloured line work. I haven't been able to find out if these were created with spot colours or painted flat with gouache, but I suspect the latter, simply because it would have been easier than creating separate artwork for each area. But it's more guesswork, I'm sorry to say. Although Ivanovsky didn't create a lot of monochrome work, what few examples there are show she was every bit as adept and engaging without benefit of colour. Between 1947 and 1949 she illustrated another 10 Marcel Verité stories, concluding with The King, the Bear and the Little Hedgehog. In the 1950s and 1960s she developed another stylistic departure, with a series of more representationally inclined books, most of which were about wildlife around the world. They were still far from realistic, but they were a long way from her earlier output, and they used radiant gouache colour, much of it applied with dry brush techniques, which made the images exceptionally evocative and visually absorbing. From 1967 to 1970, there were an astonishing 23 titles from the Tip Tip series, which was yet another of her collaborations with Marcel Verité. She carried on writing and illustrating books up to 1999, and after a remarkably creative and prolific career, Elisabeth Ivanovsky died in Brussels in 2006 at 96 years old. That's it for now, and I hope you'll join me when the next one's ready. See you then.